Heavenly Father, God, we just come before you to open your word and study it, God. I just pray that it roots down in every one of our hearts and in our minds, God, that it will make just a difference, God, that it would make such an impact in our lives that it would just change the area around us, even personally and then into the world around us, God. And I just pray that we could have an impact through the studying of your word to the world around us, and that it would just be like something that we've never seen or experienced before. We just pray this in your name, amen. Well, so we're going to continue on now, as Ben alluded to last week. We're in the book of James. And so before we go over the next three verses, so I'm going to try to cover verses 2, 3, and 4, but what I just kind of want to recap what Ben kind of laid out for us. First of all, obviously, and then the other thing is we need to understand the context of who the book is wrote to, right? That was one of the things that Ben really emphasized was, and that's John, oh gosh, I'm stammering all over myself. John MacArthur would even agree that we need to understand the context of who the book is written to really understand what the words are saying. So, James, obviously, as Ben laid out, is the half-brother of Jesus, right? So he's the author of the book. And he's writing to the persecuted Christians, Jewish converts to Christianity in Rome under Herod Agrippa, right? So that's who the book is wrote to. And this is something that we need to keep in our mind as we're reading James, so we understand or try to have an idea of what he's trying to explain to us, right? And then the other thing that Ben laid out was the kind of the overarching theme, and we haven't necessarily nailed this down 100%, but for me, as we studied through this idea of steadfastness plays out through all 5 chapters of the book of James. And so for you guys, if you guys don't know what the word steadfastness means, I looked it up. So steadfastness is the quality of being resolutely or dutifully firm and unwavering. Resolutely, or dutifully firm and unwavering. So, and as we go through James, you're going to see, as believers, we're going to go through trials and testing and all that stuff, and we're going to see that in verses 2 through 4. But as we go through those trials and tests, that our response to those should be unwavering steadfastness to the Lord and to the plan that he has for us, right? So, there's a few other words, okay? There's a few other words I want to lay out as we go through, before we dive into James, these next 3 verses, that I think it would be helpful for all of us if we know or have an idea, or just kind of to keep in mind. So the first one is count, right? In the very start of verse 2, it says count. So this is to consider or evaluate. This is not a mathematical term or reference. So we need to count. That's the thing that he says, count it all joy, right? So it's to consider or evaluate, right? Next definition, or next word, trials. So we all understand what trials are. Trials, and it's trouble, or another way to say it is something that breaks the pattern of peace. The verb form of this word means to put someone or something to the test. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind as we read through these next 3 verses. And then perfect. So he references that, he uses that word in verse 4, right? Perfect. So this is not necessarily a definition, but more how James was using this word in context to the verse, right? And this is not a reference to sunless perfection. That's an inside joke, but ask Kevin about it. But it's to spiritual maturity, right? So the word, it's actually not a reference to sinless perfection, but it's to spiritual maturity. So those, as we go along here, I just want us to keep those words in mind and keep, kind of understand what they mean and how they're being used when we start digging into these verses. The other thing that Ben referenced is James took a lot of his writing out of the Sermon on the Mount, right? So Romans 5 through 7, those are the chapters that cover the Sermon on the Mount, and James pulls a lot of his message and his writings from that. So we're going to go, before we even jump into James, we're going to go back and we're going to turn, so let's turn to Matthew. As I was preparing for this, I've read Matthew, I've read the Sermon on the Mount, but I've never really read it. So I was reading through it a couple weeks ago, and I found obviously a couple verses that really speak to or are similar to the verses we're going to look at in James. So if we go to Matthew 5, we're going to look at verses 10 through 12. And if you guys just follow along, I will read those. So it says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." All right, so that's Matthew. So now, another spot in 1 Peter we want to turn to that also mirrors or is very similar to what James is going over in these first three verses, 2, 3, and 4. Now, if somebody's got 1 Peter 1, would you read verses 6 and 7?
"In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ."
Okay, thank you, Travis. So now let's flip back to James, and we're gonna dive in. So we're looking at James 2 through 4. All right. So James says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Very, very similar words and verbiage and everything like that. The meaning, as far as from the book of Matthew to 1 Peter, all very much the same, right? To me, it was all very interesting to look at this and kind of tie it all together and see, and understand, what he's saying is, in the context of the book and who he wrote it to, was, you guys, we're going to go through trials. We're going to go through tests. That's going to happen in this walk, right? This thing called being a Christian. Things are going to happen. People are going to say things about you. On the way here, we were just listening to a sermon. This guy is a pastor out in New York. He pastors a church. He's from Australia. He was a butcher by the age of 14, dropped out of high school at 16, but gave his life to the Lord. And for 2 or 3 years in that butcher shop, he had guys around him that did nothing but curse the name of the Lord, put pornography on his workplace every morning, that he had to get rid of and deal with, all just to get him to stumble and to have some kind of an outburst or anger or something, right? But he never did. And as this guy got a scholarship to come to America to study to be a butcher, I think, if I remember right. But his manager, that was the worst of the worst to him, pulled him aside before he left and said, for 2 years, I tried everything to get you to not look like a Christian and respond, in a manner that would represent the world, right? And because you never did, he's sending, he wants his son to go to church. He's taking his son to church so he will hopefully become a Christian. So those are the trials and tribulations and the tests that we go through. Now, these these Christians back in the first century Jewish culture were going through a lot more. They were going through immense persecution. I mean, we know that because of all the stories of, you know, them being torn apart by animals in the Colosseum, you know, or being burned at the stake, or crucified upside down, right? They were literally dying because of who they had put their faith in. But, so he's encouraging these guys, don't turn back from your faith. Like, it's gonna be hard, but we can count it all joy. Like, our natural response as humans when we go through trials and tribulations is not to be joyful. Our first instinct is to, well, at least let me speak for me, ball up our fists and kind of shake my hand at the sky and go, why? What now? What am I, you know, what's going to happen next? And it just seems like it just compounds, right? At least maybe that's my life. But James is encouraging us and emphasizing us through this to do the exact opposite, right? We're to count it all joy, or consider it all joy when we go through these trials. Because why? For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, right? The reason we go through trials, the reason we have to go through hard things is because as believers, it's going to draw us into a deeper relationship with Christ. Why? So we can go out and further the gospel, right? That is why. To draw us deeper into Christ, to build up our faith, give us that foundation so that we can go out into the world. Before we go on, I guess I found a pretty good commentary I wanted to share with you guys too. This is out of the Matthew Henry commentary for James 1. So he says, these outward afflictions and troubles are temptations to them. The devil endeavors by suffering and crosses to draw men to sin and to deter them from the duty, or, and I love this, unfit them for it, right? So, don't know about you women, because I don't know how your brains work, but men, I've heard that and so many times whispered to me from the devil, right? You're unfit. If people really knew the thoughts of your heart, you're unfit, right? That's what Satan wants. He wants you to think that you're unfit for what you're called to. But our afflictions are in God's hands. They are intended for the trial and improvement of our graces. The gold is put into the furnace that it may be purified. So that's why we go through trials. That's why we're tested. That's why things happen. That's why life gets hard. But it's so that we can have an alien hope, an alien righteousness, an alien faith to this world. And that sets us apart, right? And I've heard it said, and I love this. I heard this saying from a pastor that I watch all the time. It says, Satan only comes to steal, kill, and destroy, right? We know that. That's his goal. And it just reminded me that we need to, how do we stand against all of that, right? As believers. So Ephesians 6, right? We put on the full armor of God. And this is something that I've kind of spoke on and I've had to walk it out in my life, right? But Mark 2, when Jesus heals a paralytic, right? How did the paralytic get there? He had 4 people pick up each corner of his mat and carry him there, right? And this is something, like I said, this is something that I've had to live out, and you just can't, as men, we can't just wait till we get in a bad way and then we're like, oh man, I need somebody to help me bail me out of this. Like, we have to be preparing for that beforehand. And not only that, we all have buddies or gals that we're friends with, but if we don't reach out and ordain them and put our hand, on them and say, I give you permission to speak into my life, man, grab me by the collar and say, you're not going to do that. We don't do that. We don't speak this way. You're not going to handle yourself like that. Because I love you. We need people that care more about us than what we think about them, right? And that is how we that's part of that steadfastness, right? All that comes through, and then you hit that steadfastness, and that's where we can have that unwavering dedication to the Lord. So, all right, so verse 4, let's look at that again. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So, again, that steadfastness, and that's that perfect being spiritual maturity, right? So as we go through this life, as Zach and Ben and those guys all taught in 1 Peter, right? That sanctification part, that's where I would say most of us are probably at. But it's a progressive sanctification, right? So it's a work in progress, right? We don't just get to the perfection right away, right? That's spiritual maturity. It works. It's a work. It takes time. It takes trials. It takes tests. And so that's then we get to the end of the 4 and we're lacking in nothing. So again, that spiritual maturity, we can go out, we can stand on our faith, we can share the gospel, spread the gospel, and just continue to grow the kingdom, right? That's the goal. But I'm at the end of my notes, so we're good. I really don't have much else to add to that. I guess if there's any, I'm going to open it up to questions or comments. Feel free to chime in.